Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to ITM's Dashboards webinar for the public sector. We're just going to let things ride for a couple of minutes to allow later attendees to join us. So as long as you can see something, which hopefully you can, then you know that we are live and we'll be starting in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Just for the benefit of anybody who's joined since 2 o'clock, we are silent deliberately. You're not missing anything. We're just giving people a couple of minutes grace to join the session. We'll be going live with proper speaking and everything in a minute or two's time. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ITM's Dashboards webinar for the public sector. My name is Mark Adamson. Before I go on any further, I'll just let you know that we are recording this session. That should have no impact on anybody because we can't see you, we can't see your names or anything like that. So none of what we're recording will expose you in any way other than the 4 or 5 faces across the top of the screen who are speaking today. My role at ITM is that of sales director. My job today is to host and to pass across in a moment to our first speaker, Chris Curry. Just quickly, if you were looking to join the private sector session and have joined the public sector one by mistake, the private sector one is tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. You're very welcome to stay on this one if you are in that position. Or you can drop off and re-register for the private sector one by going to the events page at ITM's website, which is itm.co.uk. So that's the events page, itm.co.uk, if you wish to re-register for the private sector session. When Lord Reith became the first Director General of the BBC in 1927, he had 3 key principles: to inform, to educate and to entertain. We'll do our best to mirror those principles this afternoon, but in case we don't, just remember the wisdom of meatloaf: 2 out of 3 ain't bad, and if we can do 2, we'll be quite happy with that. If we could go to the next slide, please, Rory. The agenda today, I've already mentioned Chris. Chris will be talking in a moment. Chris is the principal of the PDP and a very well-known face and name in the industry, of course. He'll be giving us an industry update. He'll be followed by Andrew Lowe, who is one of the ITM people talking today. Andrew is an actuary with a lot of public sector exposure in his background, and he'll be talking about what connection ready means. That word connection-ready is one you'll have heard a lot. We'll be talking about what we define that as meaning. Delighted, in addition to Chris, to have Jane Weiberg, who's Pensions Advisor for the Local Governments Association. Jane will be talking on public sector governance. And then finally, Maurice Titley, who's ITM's Chief Innovation Officer. He'll be talking about what constitutes a good ISP. Just before I do hand across to Chris, a quick word on questions. Please raise these at any time during the session using the questions facility that you can hopefully see in the panel in the top right of your screen. So just enter your details. We will take as many of these questions as we can, but we won't be taking them until the end of the presentation. So we've got 10 or 12 minutes set aside for Q&A later on, but please do raise your questions as we go, and we'll do our best to address as many of those as we can. Right, that's enough from me. Chris, let me hand across to you to take us through your industry update. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. As Mark has said, my name is Chris Curry and I'm Principal of the Pensions Dashboards Programme here at the Money and Pension Service. What I'm planning to do today is to give you a bit of an update on the dashboards landscape, touch a little bit on what we're doing and the programme and some of the milestones we've got coming up, and then a little bit about how we work to support and collaborate with all of you in the industry as well going forward. I would say that over the past few months, we've definitely made some significant progress and revising the delivery plan to fit with the new connection deadline of the 31st of October 2026. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as well. I'll also go into some detail around the work on the connection that we're doing in standards and user testing, and a bit of an overview on the programme and what we've got planned for the rest of this year. Before I do get started, though, I just really want to say thank you in a way. It's been a really great experience over the last few months. We know that the industry, the government and the regulators have all been working with us in a real collaborative spirit. And I'm speaking on behalf of the whole team at the Pensions Dashboard Programme that we are very, very grateful for all of the hard work and commitment that you're showing alongside our team here to make Pensions Dashboards a reality. So I'll start with a bit of an update on the connection deadline and the guidance. And as you all know, this has changed a little bit from this time last year, but all pension providers and schemes in scope of the legislation will be required to connect to the ecosystem. And so the preparation work that you need to do is very important. The amendments have recently been updated and amended, and there is now just a single connection deadline in the regulations, which, as I hope everyone is aware, is the 31st of October 2026, and that is the date by which all of the relevant schemes covered by the legislation need to connect to the ecosystem. Now, that doesn't mean that we're expecting everybody to wait until September 2026 before they start connecting to us. And those of you that remember, there was a previous connecting staging timeline that was in regulations. That's now going to be replaced by a timeline in guidance, and that will set out in a very similar way when different cohorts of schemes based on the type and size of scheme will be expected to connect. And although it's not regulations, pension providers and schemes will need to have regard to this guidance, and it's something that both the FCA and the TPR will be watching very closely. And as well as the DWP updating their regulations, the FCA have also updated their rules to be in line with the new revised approach. So having a deadline provides certainty for the industry and also makes sure that connection is mandatory. It has to happen by that particular date. But by having a staging timetable in guidance, that provides the phased approach to connection that is really important, both from the programme's perspective to help us manage the volume and flow of connections, to help ensure that everybody connects on time, to ensure that potentially some of the later organisations connecting have learned the lessons from those coming in earlier, and allow us to support the industry in a staged and stable way throughout the programme going forward. Another advantage of having this phased connection process is also that it allows us to have more extensive user testing. And again, if we have more user testing earlier, that again will make it possible to launch the service earlier. We're expecting that the timetable and guidance will be published by the Department for Work and Pensions, who own that guidance, in spring of this year. So if anything If the weather is anything with you like it is here today, look out the window. It doesn't seem like spring is around the corner, but it actually is not too far away. The aim is to publish the guidance to give at least 12 months notice ahead of the first connection date. So you can see that that will have to come relatively quickly. The department have in fact already shared some previous drafts of the timetable, so please do contact your administrator or ISP to get some indication from them as to when that might be. In advance of the wider industry staging, though, we'll be working very closely with volunteer participants. That's generally those who are building a direct route into the connection, on plans to start connecting with them later this year, so in advance of the guidance happening. So we've set out our roadmap to connection for participants, including plans when we intend to share the updated information that they need to support the connection, and that includes updated standards. So as you can see, there are a number of different standards and sets of guidance which the Pensions Dashboards Programme and the Money and Pension Service are responsible for, which are set out in the Pension Schemes Act of 2021. And all of these relate to the practical operations of pensions dashboard services and the digital infrastructure was needed to support them, which is a major part of course, of what the programme is doing in constructing that infrastructure. So the standards include the data standards, technical standards, reporting standards, and the code of connection, which are all relevant to those schemes and providers who will be connecting into the infrastructure. But there's also the design standards that dashboard firms will need to abide by. And these sit alongside and complement the FCA's rules for dashboard services, which in fact came into force today. So very, very hot off the press that the FCA regulations are now in force around providing qualifying pensions dashboard services. So these aren't new. So we've held consultations on draft versions for the previous 2 years, and the feedback that we've received has really helped us to improve the clarity and refine the standards as we go forward. And we're continuing to work on those at the moment, and the versions of the standards that will support connection testing and wider industry staging will be published throughout the rest of this year. The next version of the data standards, for example, will be published soon, around the same time as the publication of the staging timetable in guidance. And the others will look to publish updated versions once they've been tested and validated with our industry participants, as I mentioned, those building a direct route to connection. So we'll be testing the standards as well as testing the infrastructure as we go through the rest of this year. Now, I've mentioned a number of times about the organisations that we work for, and there are a number, such as the Department for Work and Pensions, the regulators and industry that we work with in a range of different ways. And I think it's very important to highlight at this point that it's not just a question of these are organisations that we talk to, these are also organisations that we listen to, and the feedback that we receive from them is always very much appreciated, as will be your questions as we go through the session today. So we have a wide range of groups and forums which we use to support their industry, and to get their feedback back into the programme. That includes the Connection Forum, which some of you may have attended, which is open to anybody. It includes our volunteer participants, but also the wider industry, and covers any issues relating to the connection to the dashboard ecosystem. And at the other end there, you can see the Dashboards Forum, which has a very similar role, but for those who are interested in developing and hosting a pensions dashboard. And there are also a number of ad hoc discussion forums which we put in place, in particular around thorny issues. We've had a number around AVCs, for example, and value data requirements, and there'll be more of those planned as we go through the rest of this year and uncover areas where we've been told that people would like to have or need to have more information. We also have a number of different working groups. So we have the Connection Delivery Group, which works with our volunteer participants and looks at the testing and refining the process around building that connection. And we're also looking to set up a similar group for those who are going to be constructing pension dashboards later on as well. A communications group that we work with representatives from across the industry who work in comms, engagements and public relations to make sure that we're able to reach the people that we need to reach, both in the industry and beyond, to get the information there and also to receive that all-important feedback. And as I mentioned, user testing being a very important part of what we're doing, this year we're launching a user testing and planning group that will help plan and coordinate user testing activity, which I will cover on the next slide. Just before I move on to the user testing, we also have our pensions dashboards advisory group, which we are currently in the process of expanding. In the next couple of weeks, you'll hear a little bit more about that. This group really provides an opportunity for all of those stakeholders that we work with to offer their insight and to help us shape the delivery of pensions dashboards. But I mentioned that user testing is a crucial part of ensuring a really reliable user experience. And I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes telling you what it is that we are planning to do in this area and why it's so important. So once the first pension providers and schemes are connected to the live dashboards ecosystem, we'll be looking to undertake the testing that we need with real individuals using real data to see what they understand and how they understand it when they look at their pensions. And this is really important because it needs to demonstrate the end-to-end user experience, and we need to get feedback on that to understand how we can make it as positive, as safe as possible, and also that it meets the user's needs. So the people using dashboards may use it for a number of different reasons, but we need to know that when they come onto dashboards, they're able to meet their expectations of what it is they want to achieve. So the type of testing can be carried out at scale and provide insights on behaviours and the success, for example, of data matching, which is a very important topic, which again, we have spent a lot of time talking about and will continue to spend a lot of time talking about, I'm sure. But most importantly, we had the deadline for connection earlier that you saw of 31st of October 2026. That's the only date that has currently been released. There's another important date, which is the dashboards available point, which is the time at which dashboards will be made available to the public. Now that date, we don't have a date for that at the moment because there are a number of factors which need to be taken into account, and the regulations say that the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions will make the decision as to when that point is and give the industry 6 months notice of when that is going to be. But one of the things that will help inform that decision is how well the service performs with the public. So the user testing will really help to inform whether people are understanding what it is that they see, whether they feel safe in the environment, whether the data that comes through is the right data and is accurate, and therefore whether dashboards can be launched in such a way to give a positive experience to the people using them. To help with all of this, we're planning to launch a user testing and planning group, which will help us to develop and coordinate plans for the user testing as we go through. And that's also going to include defining the requirements and activities, how we're going to invite people to do the testing in the service in a controlled environment, how many and what kind of insights will be gathered and how we're going to be reporting them back. And we'll be continuing to work with industry partners to develop these plans over the next few months. We will, of course, regularly share updates from the group and from the user testing once it's begun, because I think it's going to be just as important for anyone else who's also looking to provide dashboards to understand how users interact with pensions dashboards and how they can get a positive experience from that. So just before I hand over to Andrew, just a final plea, really, as I've mentioned a number of times, collaboration is a really important part of what we're doing, and we're really keen for as many people as possible to stay in touch with us in as many different ways as is possible. We'd like to make it as easy as we can for you to stay in touch with us. So you can use the email address directly that you can see on there. You can visit our website where there's a range of articles, videos and reports. And we also have regular newsletters and frequently asked questions, which we publish as well as the usual social media approach. So a number of different ways that you can stay in touch with the programme to make sure that you're always up to date with what the latest information is that's coming out. That's all I wanted to cover. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to answering some of your questions later. But for now, I'd like to hand over to Andrew.
Thanks very much, Chris. So at the risk of upsetting Mark, I will actually answer one of the questions that's come through in the chat because it's come through multiple times already. So in the interest of saving everybody's fingers, we will share a copy of the slides after the event. So yeah, nobody needs to ask us that again. So yeah, not to worry. So what am I going to talk about? We're going to talk in this section about what it means to be connection ready. And really, in the interests of having something to focus on, we're going to look at the PASA Connection Ready guidance. As PASA's dashboards expert partner at ITM, we've had a lot of influence and put a lot of thought into helping provide connection ready guidance for the dashboard or for dashboards. And that has now been distilled into 5 pillars of connection readiness. These are the 5 pillars that we've got, and I'm just going to talk a little about each of them before we then talk about what it means under each of those to be connection ready, what the timeline for becoming connection ready may look like, and then how that will manifest for all of public sector schemes, but also the rest of the industry, what that looks like in terms of delivery, and who will be doing the delivery underneath each of those pillars, and what options that you may have to try and make sure that you're ready in advance of the staging, connection, guidance deadlines that Chris has mentioned. And then after that, I'll hand over to Jane to talk more about the perspective, her perspective from the LGA side, and what that means for public sector schemes. So pillar 1 is really governance readiness, and this probably isn't anything that's too new or original to dashboards. Really, it's about getting a plan in place that will enable delivery of all of the rest of the elements of connection readiness, make sure that the relevant stakeholders are involved, make sure decision-making framework exists, etc. So again, not something that you would see that's specific to dashboards, but really important to get that framework in place such that the rest of the connection readiness pillars can be delivered effectively. The second pillar is matching readiness. And this really involves looking at the personal data that you've got for your scheme members, considering off the back of that what an appropriate matching approach might be, testing that matching approach to try and understand how effective it might be. And by that, I mean how many people you may actually return as full matches, depending on the data that they put into dashboards, and therefore what will you have to return to dashboards. Off the back of that, you may wish to consider improving the quality of personal data that you hold, whether that's through tracing services, updating addresses, contacting members, whatever that might look like. But that may well move non-matches or possible matches into a position where people will be able to match through dashboards, which will be crucial to their ability to use them, and potentially stop queries that you as schemes may have to end up dealing with if people can't find their benefits on dashboards. At the end of that, we'd look to really make sure that you've got a matching readiness statement that articulates all of the thinking and decisions that have been made around matching. Similar to matching, pillar 3 is pension values readiness. And pension values, really we're talking about the general view data that is returned to dashboards once a match has been made. So this will include administrative and signpost data, including things like details of employment history and how to contact the administrator to get further information. But perhaps with more complexity and more importance to look at earlier is some of the information around pension values, making sure that that can be returned in line with the dashboard's regs and standards. And also, as Chris alluded to, the complexities of making sure that AVCs are appropriately returned. I'm sure Jane will pick that point up again. I know she's done a lot of guidance or is writing a lot of guidance around that too. And obviously, in terms of production of these pension values and returning them to dashboards, there will potentially be changes to other scheme data that you hold and processes that are undertaken on a regular basis. So this pillar will have a further influence on some of that. And similar to the matching readiness, a pension values readiness statement is probably appropriate too. Technology readiness, whilst obviously very, very significant, is potentially one of the more straightforward in terms of the elements that underpin it. This is really about selecting the right approach for connecting to dashboards for your scheme, installing it, configuring it, testing it, making sure that it works. And then pillar 5, administration readiness. This is perhaps a little bit down the track from where we are today, but no less important to ensure that we're ready for dashboards when they're live. And that really is making sure that we've got business processes in place to deal with queries, making sure that we can handle production of all of the data, deal with the MI and reporting that dashboards will require, both externally perhaps through the connection through to maps, but also in terms of internal stakeholders and the MI and reporting that they'll require, consideration of whether or not it has an impact and influence on other member communications and approach to those. Ultimately, dashboards will have an impact on quite a lot of different elements of your overall operating model, and therefore consideration of your future target operating model in the context of dashboards is really important. So if we move on to thinking about connection readiness timeline, here is a very simplified timeline of the different elements, the different pillars that we've talked about on the previous slide. And as Chris alluded to, the staging guidance dates will be revealed formally soon, but I'm sure it won't be lost on many attendees here who've had various conversations that 6 quarters, 18 months from now happens to be September 2025, and that may or may not be a relevant date for this stakeholder group. And what we're saying here is that it may take around 18 months to perform all of the activities to reach the point of connection ready. And whilst all connection journeys are different, and we know that there are very few schemes who will have done nothing at this point in terms of their preparation for dashboards, we also know that there are no schemes who have reached the end point and are connection ready, because that just isn't possible as we sit here today in March 2024. One of the key constraints here to think about is resource, and that's not just yours at scheme level, but of all of the suppliers who will be supporting not just your scheme, but potentially lots of other schemes right across this connection guidance window. So the next 2 to 3 years obviously is going to be a really significant time here with lots of activity, and making sure that you are ahead of the game in terms of engaging your suppliers to support in this activity is really, really crucial, because there is a lot to understand. There are potentially going to be gaps that you've got to fill in, and making sure that you can prioritize your delivery plan and have it effectively scheduled in with all of your suppliers is really important. So thinking about that, we're going to move on to talk about who can help you deliver each of these pillars. Obviously, within the governance space, that's really going to be looked after or overseen by scheme manager and administrator in this instance. Obviously, scheme manager will have influence and insight and oversight of decision making across the other pillars, but they're probably not going to be doing the do. However, your administrator is going to be a crucial part of this throughout the whole, throughout all of the pillars. And if we look at matching readiness, there are other suppliers and experts who may be involved in supporting here when it comes to thinking about preparing that matching personal data, testing your matching criteria, consideration of improvements, etc. So making sure that you've got your data experts, your ISP provider aligned with this. And Maurice is going to talk a little bit later on about what makes a good ISP provider and ensuring that you can get the support that you require across all of these pillars, not just the technology one. But yes, again, pension values readiness. We talked a little bit about AVC provider, making sure that they're aligned, whether or not they're connecting separately to yourselves, or whether or not they're providing you data so that you can provide AVC information. It is a complex area, and making sure that they can support your needs at the right time is crucial. Again, data experts, ISP provider, platform provider, your admin platform provider may be looking at producing dashboard specific calculations, so that's important too. Technology readiness, again, your administrator, but your ISP provider is going to be crucial to that, whether it's aligned to your admin platform or not. And then the last pillar, administration readiness, again, a lot of the elements of ISP connection and delivery of data to and from your ISP will be crucial here. So therefore, again, you would want to have them involved in the planning of this as early as possible. So I will stop talking now about the general approach to connection readiness and hand over to Jane so that she can talk a bit more about public sector governance. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, my name's Jane Myberg and I'm a pensions advisor at the Local Government Association. So, what are we? Well, the Local Government Association is the national voice for local government. We're a politically led organisation. Essentially, we work on behalf of councils to make sure that the councils have a strong and credible voice with national government. We aim to influence, set the political agenda on issues that matter to our councils so that they can deliver local solutions to national problems. I work in the pensions team at the LGA and we look after the local government pension scheme. We're one voice representing 86 LGPS administering authorities in England and Wales on behalf of 6.5 million members. We represent the interests of those authorities at a national level with government and other bodies. We're also the central point of contact for government who issue information to us, and we spread that information to the wider LGPS community. We also support the LGPS in Scotland, which is a completely separate scheme to the LGPS in England and Wales. And for both schemes, we provide a complete suite of communications support, communications, member and technical websites, training, plus lots more. So last year, we published our Dashboards Connection Guide. We did this to try to achieve consistency because we have 4.5 million members in scope of dashboards, and also to help our administering authorities implement dashboards. Although it's aimed at the LGPS and it uses terms local to the LGPS, the principles are the same for all of the public sector schemes and private sector schemes. The key point of the guide is not to duplicate published information. Rather, it has a series of steps throughout the guide, and it provides a synopsis of each step with online links to where you can find detailed information. For occupational schemes, there's a general rule of thumb. You go to TPR guidance first, followed by guidance with PDP and PASA. Now, within the guide, we've set out lots of decisions that you need to make and actions that you need to take. And these are categorised into 7 areas. What we're going to look at today is the key governance areas. One of the most important areas is about you keeping yourselves and your stakeholders up to date. You need to sign up for online news alerts. It's one of the best ways that you can keep it up to date with all developments. And these can be signed up with TPR, PDP or PASA. You need to make sure that you discuss your dashboards with your relevant stakeholders to make sure that they're up to date also. Your relevant stakeholders are generally your software providers, your legal advisors, employers, AVC providers in multiple if you have more than one AVC providers, and if your administration is handled by a third party, then your third party administrator. Now, in the public sector, we have something called local pension boards, and in the LGPS, we have pensions committee as well as local pension boards. It's very important that these boards and committees are kept up to date. Dashboards should be a standing agenda item on each meeting. Updates should include the latest positions set out in the bullet points that I put on the screen. Now, the key areas of governance. The next 3 slides, I'm just going to hop through these key areas just to give you a flavour of what you should be looking at. You're going to need to make decisions, and these are going to be about your connection budget, your routes to connection, your resource. You'll also need to incorporate dashboards into your wider data management plan. You're going to need to decide on your matching criteria for both your main scheme benefits and your AVCs. You'll also need to understand the day-to-day processes of dashboards and the information requirements. Now, lots of the information requirements will come from within the ecosystem, so these will produce automatic reports and feed directly back up to the wider areas in this. But there will be some areas that you are going to have to establish local processes for, because these can't be derived from the ecosystem, such as complaints. These will be logged outside of the dashboard ecosystem. Now, I'll say the last key areas really for me was what I think is probably the most important one at the moment. It's a very topical flavour. AVCs and dashboards, certainly for the LGPS, are a huge area and they really should not be underestimated. You're going to need to plan how to reconcile your AVC membership with your main scheme records. You're going to need to do this because what we can't have is when an individual goes onto the dashboard, the AVC records not aligning with their member records in the LGPS. That isn't quite the same for the other public service schemes, but certainly for the LGPS, there's much more of a closer alignment. You're also going to need to understand what AVC view data is displayed on dashboards, and that will help you make an informed decision as to how your AVC data will be returned to dashboards, i.e. multiple source, so both you return it and your AVC provider returns the data, or single source, which is where you obtain the AVC data and then you send it on to dashboards. You'll also need to agree the AVC illustration date with your AVC providers. Currently, the AVC illustration date and the main scheme date is the same. We are raising queries about this because we know that this is going to be a very difficult area. Now, I'll probably save the best slide for me to, most important slide for me to last. Recording your decisions. Dashboards is very much about keeping clear audit trails. You need to keep clear audit trails of the steps you take to comply with your dashboard duties. This is going to help TPI be provided with a round and transparent view of your efforts to comply with legislation. So you're going to need to document how you arrived at all of your decisions and the parties you talk to in doing so. If you do this, it should help you identify any anomalies or gaps in your implementation processes. Once dashboards go live, which might be at quite a considerable time in the future from the position we're currently at now, but they will eventually do so, you're going to need to maintain these audit trails with any of the changes that you make in the future. Now, that might be, you might have decided on a matching criteria, and then you, after 6 months of it operating in the live environment, it might not work. So you might need to tweak it. You need to audit, keep an audit trail of that, talk about who you've actually talked to and why you decided to change things. So you're keeping clear audit trails about the decisions you make from the outset, but then you will need to keep clear audit trails about any of the changes to those decisions. Now, where can you find the guide? The guide is on the LGPS website. It's on the Administrator Resources page. Click into it and go onto the Administrator Guides and Document page, and the guide is available for download. Very short and sweet from me, but I was trying to catch up as I've noticed that we've run over a little bit. So now I'm going to thank you for listening, and I'm going to hand over to Maurice.
Thank you very much, Jane. So I'm Maurice Titley, I'm Chief Innovation Officer at ITM, and I'm responsible for our dashboards proposition. And I'm going to be asking what makes a good ISP. And just to start with, just thinking about what an ISP actually is. So ISP stands for Integrated Services Provider. They provide the data for dashboards across a number of schemes and funds to connect in with the dashboards themselves and with the central architecture that Chris's team are building. Some parties out there create their own connection, which means they're not technically an ISP, but for the purposes of this, all the same sort of questions sort of arise and the same sort of criteria apply in terms of what makes a good ISP. So I'll just refer to them as ISPs as we go through. So what does make a good ISP? Well, ISPs are about much more than just connecting into the architecture and the dashboards that Chris and his team have been setting up. So they have a lot more to do than that. Some of what they need to do is defined by the Pensions Dashboards Programme. So that connection piece obviously is. Some of the reporting that they need to do to the centre and the reporting that will end up with the pensions regulator, that's defined by PDP in terms of what that looks like. But a lot of it isn't defined, so there's a lot of innovation required. And there's areas where innovation is needed from ISPs, as shown on this sort of wheel of ISP activity we've got here. I mean, one example is matching. The regulations set out what needs to be done in terms of matching, and Andrew was covering some of that earlier on in terms of what it looks like in terms of the connection ready guidance. But it doesn't actually explain how it needs to be done. And PASA themselves have produced 2 sets of guidance that help with this how, but it's then up to the ISPs to decide how they want to support this and how they want to innovate their own technology to support different ways of doing that matching. And we'll come on to that a bit more in a moment. So, firstly, we're going to focus on the connection part of what an ISP does. So this is all about working closely with PDP. 3 main sort of aspects to look at. Firstly, although you're connecting into something, you obviously need to build and test your side of that connection. That build could start back in 2022, and all the budding ISPs are ready to do their upgrades to the new data standards that are due in the next few months. Then you need to test your connection with the PDP ecosystem. We were fortunate as Pension Fusion to be the first alpha tester to connect to that ecosystem in 2022, and we're now part of a wider group of early participants that are actually doing that testing later this year. The most important aspect, though, as to what makes a good ISP is that you need to be able to connect into that system in good time and be in that production mode, ready for clients who want to connect ahead of their dates, and whatever those dates end up being. Most schemes are going to want to connect safely ahead of their confirmed connection date rather than leave it to the last day, which is definitely something that all the guidance is going to back up quite clearly. So moving on to the next one here, thinking about the service levels that PDP set in terms of how find and view requests are responded to. This is a key area that defines a good ISP. So the response times that are set out in standards, and the last sort of version of those standards from a while ago now had various targets, and these targets are quite demanding in terms of actually finding a pension and registering a newly found pension. There's a 15-second target to do that. In terms of responding to a view request that comes straight from a dashboard, so this is somebody actually looking at that dashboard, waiting to see in real time what their pension value is, there's a 2-second target for that response. So clearly meeting those targets is really important, and how the ISP is sort of handling that under the bonnet and testing what they do to make sure they can do that is a really key measure. 24/7 service availability is the other key aspect of this. The coded connection, which is the PDP standard that refers to this, specifies a 99.5% availability 24/7. So dashboards are not just there for business hours, they're there 24/7 use by individuals. And of course, if one of the ISPs is down in some way, that's a very bad experience for savers who could have all manner of pensions they hold with that ISP not being found and returned when they do their search. Last but not least, a good ISP needs to support the administrator in how they have other service levels they need to follow through on. One of which is the 3 and 10 day rule that you may well be familiar with, which is if you don't have the calculation of the pension value ready to provide straight away, there's 3 days for DC or 10 days for DB, so it's mostly DB for our audience today, but keeping track of that and making sure the ISP can support you in that journey, making sure you don't miss that deadline and are able to update that data is a really important aspect. Another aspect of what makes a good ISP is how that matching is implemented, and we touched on that earlier on. What does it mean to have good matching capabilities? Well, firstly, I think the matching criteria themselves have to be flexible so that scheme managers and trustees have enough choice to match their preferences in terms of match criteria, and their preferences will be informed to some extent by the data they know they hold. How deep is that data? How many different items do they hold reliably for their membership, and what's the quality of that data? There also has to be an effective approach to possible matching. Possible matching is the safety net that catches members who've got some data problems on one side of the fence or the other, and they need to be caught, but equally you don't want to send too many false alarms and make that net catch lots of other individuals using dashboards who aren't in your scheme at all. So there's some PASA guidance that goes into this in quite some detail, the second PASA matching guidance that's available. And lastly, this was covered by Andrew and Jane, when you're actually looking at defining a matching approach, this matching approach is just what you start with, it's what you open the batting with. But you will learn much more once individuals are using dashboards. And the most important thing I always think you'll learn is how much extra data people actually put in when they're searching for pensions. Do they put their NI number in or not? Do they put their previous address in? And that will actually impact the way you do your matching and how successful your various criteria are. You need to be able to measure the performance of your matching once you start receiving lots of fine requests. Most importantly, looking at possible match responses, how many end up with a full match, how many ended up being a waste of time, and you can then monitor that and make changes. But how easy it is to make those changes is a very good benchmark for an ISP, because I think they're going to have to be made quite quickly in those early days, particularly around the dashboard's availability point when use is going to be really peaking. So lastly, just two briefer areas, look at where ISPs can sort of extend beyond their core territory and add value. Andrew touched on this earlier. So in terms of looking at matching readiness, that's one of the PASA connection ready pillars. So ISPs are well placed to do personal data analysis, looking at data held on the admin data they're going to be working with, comparing it with financial reference data from credit reference agencies, comparisons of full name, surname, date of birth and postcode can all be done, identifying the gaps and issues that you see in that. And of course, some of those issues might be relatively minor things like typos in surname or typo in a date of birth, which is more common than you might think, but they still cause a big problem for matching. But then the ISP can really add some value here by saying, right, we've looked at lots of data, we can see lots of discrepancies, but how will it actually impact matching? How many members do we think will not be able to find their pensions because of these issues? And the ISP is well placed to do this. They know what the matchings are they support. They know if they support a concept called fuzzy matching, which is where a typo in something like a surname or a date of birth can be spotted, and a possible match response could be given off the back of it. So they will understand that and are best placed to tell you what your data quality really means for matching and whether it is worth making improvements to it right now. Last but not least, to actually make those improvements, it's not an easy thing to do in some cases, but there are clear data improvements that you tend to be able to see in data, and the ISP can help you by setting those out in a clear way and making sure you know what's worth doing and what isn't worth doing up front. Last but not least, in terms of ISPs adding value, is the whole area of pension values and ABCs. Jane has touched on this, and Jane knows better than anyone the sort of the complexities that we've seen in this area. The thing with ABCs is that whichever way you look at it, there is going to be data coming from a different party. It might be the ABC providers connecting ABCs, but even if they are, we'd still strongly recommend there's regular feeds of data coming into the scheme administrator to reconcile those data sets. So the ISP is pretty well suited to assist with this. They could assist with capturing data on an ongoing basis. If you're actually putting ABCs on yourself as a scheme administrator, the other thing the ISP can help with is making sure that that data all goes on at the same time across all different benefits for a specific member. So if the ABC is now moving on to next year's illustration date, let's hold everything else back and move it all on at the same time. And the ISP is the last port of call before that data is exposed to dashboards. So it's well placed to sort of do that kind of marshalling. So yeah, lots of different ways that ISPs can sort of extend beyond their sort of core activities to help clients further. So Mark, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Maurice. For those of you who've heard Maurice speak before, you may realise that's a world record. He completed his speech in his 10 minutes allocated. This has never happened before. Well done. We have a number of questions coming in from different directions, so we're just going to try and work through some of those. First one, Chris, probably for you to kick off with, and Jane may have comment as well. What are the primary objectives of implementing pensions dashboards within the public sector?
Okay, thanks for that, Mark. So really, it's the same as it is in the private sector. The whole rationale behind pensions dashboards is to allow people to find information about their pensions online securely and in one place. And that's no different for people who work in the public sector than it is for people who work in the private sector. We do quite often hear that, well, people who work in the public sector stay in the same job and in the same scheme right the way through their lives. So why do they need a pensions dashboard? Well, firstly, there's always another pension they have, the state pension, and so dashboards will show the state pension alongside that. We've had a lot of conversation about AVCs as well. I think, but there's also a couple of other things which are really relevant. Firstly, not everybody in the public sector stays in the same job and the same scheme, and we're seeing a lot more movement, I think, in recent years than we have done historically. And also, there are a lot more pensions outside of the public sector than there have been historically. So people who may have spent part of the year in the private sector but not had pensions before now will be automatically enrolled, or those who go on to work outside of the public sector towards the end of their careers will have pensions as well. So finding that information is really important. But secondly, it's not just about the numbers. There's also going to be lots of information through pensions dashboards, which will help people understand the context in which they can see their pensions, but also signposting for help for where to go next and to help understand what they can do, what the next start part in the journey might be to improve their financial confidence and their understanding of their pensions, as well as just knowing how much is in there. So all of those are just as relevant for the public sector.
Excellent, thanks, Chris. Jane, would you add anything to that?
Yes, there's just probably a small point. Not all public service pension schemes have to issue deferred member annual benefit statements. So if you've got a deferred benefit in a public service scheme that's not required to issue an annual benefit statement, you might not have been issued one since you've left. So the dashboards will actually provide you with an up-to-date value of what your deferred benefit's worth in that scheme.
Excellent, Jane, thank you. Next question is around AVC providers, which is an interesting one. Jane, you might like to kick off on this one, and I know Morris probably will want to add a few thoughts as well. So the question is, when should we start talking to our AVC providers? And then there's a follow-up specifically for the LGA. What work is the LGA doing to support funds with AVCs? Jane.
Okay, thanks, Mark. The question, when should you start contact them? Now, as soon as possible. It's going to be a huge job. You need to reconcile your main scheme records with your AVC records. Once you've reconciled, which is no small feat, you then need to maintain your reconciliation. So it's not a one-off job. You're going to have processes in place forever, basically, as long as the dashboards are around. What's the LGA doing to support you? Well, not necessarily the LGA, but the National LGPS Technical Group have a subgroup set up, which is made up of administrative authorities on it. We have 2 big Mets on it, plus Northern Ireland are on it, plus another county council authority on it. 2 of those bodies have recently been working with our largest AVC provider, which is the Prudential, to work out processes and discover, sort of iron out any issues when you're trying to do your reconciliation. And what we are then going to do with that outcome is put that into an AVCs and dashboards guide. We have decided that the guide will contain the reconciliation process, a pros and cons process, which was wrote by Chris Connolly, who worked with who's seconded to PDP and was led on the AVC area. Chris is, he actually works for Hayward's, again, which is one of our largest software suppliers. So I'll have a pros and cons, and then the guide will split into 2 areas. It will be single source and multiple source. So the pros and cons will look at whether or not you should be sending the AVC data yourself, or your AVC provider is going to send the AVC data. Whatever outcome you come to at the end of that, having read all the pros and cons and decisions and taken any other valid inputs that you might need to consider into account, The guide will then split off into 2 areas. It will have a list of all the questions and considerations you need to think about for single source, and the same again for multiple source. What we can't do is give you recommendations, because when we worked with Prudential on this, we found that it was very much chicken and egg. It depended what you did and what your members were and how you operate. So we came to the conclusion the best thing to do was to find as many questions, and at the moment there's around 70 questions in the guide. Write them all down, and then you can contact the AVC providers to do that. Now, I guess for some of the bigger AVC providers, once they know which route you're going to take, they will be able to answer those questions en masse. But some of the smaller AVC, when I say smaller AVC providers, these are big bodies, but we might only have 100 members who've got AVCs with them. Those are the ones that you will need to contact individually directly, and I expect those are the ones that may be slightly, I wouldn't say difficult, but slightly more cumbersome to iron out the end results.
Jane, thank you very much. That's great. Maurice.
And yeah, so just add to that. So I mean, as Jane says, this whole sort of reconciliation between the records the ABC providers hold and the records that the scheme holds is absolutely key. With PASA, we're doing some work to create some guidance that is essentially really is sort of just a broader piece of guidance. It isn't just public sector focused, but looks wider. But an awful lot of it is going to have the same sort of issues that Jane talked about. It's interesting to think that there is a matching challenge in here, because when you try and match up the data the ABC provider holds with the scheme's records for the first time, that is a sort of a matching piece that has to be done. But actually, what of course you really want to do with that is do that once, and then from that point onwards have some kind of shared reference or something that means you don't have to keep doing it. So it's not like dashboards where you keep having to match every time someone uses the Finder service. That problem can hopefully be solved. But of course, as Jane says, for the AVCs in LGPS, it's a very live issue, and they have so many new AVC payers that come in, whereas in the private sector, of course, that's much less common. So yeah, completely agree with what Jane says. I would say probably, yeah, reach out now, but also if you're reaching out in a couple of months' time, you might find there's more bits of guidance that are coming out that will help to do that. And it would be wonderful if PASA and LGA were able to reach out from the centre to every AVC provider and sort of get them having sort of one size fits all, I guess, wouldn't it, Jane? I know PASA have thought about doing that, and we're going to do our best, but I think that's probably not going to be 100% achieved, I suspect.
Thanks, Maurice. One final question. Andrew, I'm giving you 60 seconds to respond to this one, so brevity to be applauded. What are the most important areas of connection readiness to be addressing now?
Oh, good question. Okay, so I think the most important thing is to remember that this is a new requirement, and therefore it's about understanding what you are going to need to service dashboards that you don't already have. So whether that's the certain elements of data, whether that's calculations for value data, whether it's the technology, your ISP to connect to dashboards, whatever those things are that you don't have, you need to understand what the requirements for those are. Once you've done that, you can, alongside the sort of stakeholder governance that you'll have set up in the governance pillar, you will be able to make the right decisions about what to do next. So really it is about understanding what gaps you've got and going from there.
Super, that's great, Andrew, within 60 seconds as well. Everybody, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Not only did we have a very large number joining, we had a very small number who dropped out before the end, so that's great. Thank you for that. Thank you too to Chris and Jane, our guest speakers. Delighted to hear from you. It's very good to hear what you had to say. I'll say cheerio. Thanks again for joining us. My email address is on the screen there. If you want to talk to us about anything dashboards related, anything you've heard about today, please don't hesitate to contact me. Many thanks all the best. Bye now.
Thank you.